Let me do this. All right, then I will start introducing you. Let me pull up my notes. All right, so it is our pleasure today to have Olivier Hénaff here as a speaker for the Deep Vision seminar sponsored by Qualcomm-UvA. Unfortunately, you're not here with us in person, otherwise we could have grabbed a beer afterwards. Yeah, Olivier Hénaff is a scientist at DeepMind. He's done his PhD prior to this at NYU with a math and physics background, if I remember correctly, and has been quite influential in the computer vision community with works like CPC, the Perceiver, and of course, more recently with dense self-supervised learning works, which is of course what he's here to talk about today. So without further ado, thanks for being here, and go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Yuki, for the very nice introduction and the invitation to come over here, albeit virtually, to tell you about the work of our team at DeepMind, which generally kind of revolves around the intersection between scene understanding and self-supervised learning. But maybe before kind of diving into the actually kind of nuts and bolts of our day-to-day work at DeepMind, I thought that I'd maybe just take a step back and maybe just kind of shed a little bit of light on my inspiration and motivation actually for like a lot of this work. And so one thing that Yuki didn't say is that actually my PhD was in visual neuroscience, and so maybe because of that, I think I tend to, and in fact our team at DeepMind tends to look towards the animal kingdom oftentimes for inspiration on kind of how to solve the next generation of challenges, both in computer vision and artificial intelligence. And this thing seems to be a pretty reasonable approach because actually, in fact, humans and animals are actually able to deploy some pretty amazingly sophisticated behaviors. We can see, for example, this leopard chasing this rabbit, and both agents are actually engaged in an amazingly complex set of inferences about the other agents' behavior and trajectory and speed and intentions. These environments are changing extraordinarily fast, and yet they're able to make these kind of split-second decisions that are hopefully going to be maximizing the reward in the very near term. And so that was the example of this sort of chase between two different biological agents, but we can also see that in the ibex, who's kind of scaling this this man-made wall, in fact, and who's sort of exquisitely balancing in a sense different sort of sensory modalities. So that could be sort of proprioception, but also vestibular signals informing it about the ways in which it's balancing on these kind of extraordinarily precarious holds, and it's able to kind of scale this wall in a way that kind of rivals our best engineered systems. And maybe what's kind of so fascinating actually about these behaviors is that we think that the neural representations that support them are largely unsupervised. And on top of that, not only are they unsupervised, but we actually think that the underlying learning algorithm is in fact general. So we imagine that in all cases, both the rabbits, the leopard, and the ibex are actually all kind of relying on sets of representations that, granted, operate on different modalities. It might be vision on the one hand, but audio on the other hand, and kind of proprioception and vestibular signals on the other one. And yet we sort of believe that it's the same learning algorithm that is taking all of these kind of raw sensory inputs and then kind of extracting their structure and kind of making sense of them in a way that's going to support their sort of behavioral programs and their evolutionary needs. So and I think we can see this kind of data efficiency at play in these two examples, in that hopefully this rabbit on the top image has only really been presented with the situation once. And similarly, the ibex on the bottom image is kind of able to handle this environment, which is man-made. And so clearly the evolutionary program could not have sort of planned for this particular outcome, and yet it's kind of seamlessly generalizing to these very, very new inputs. And I think that maybe the other reason for looking to the animal kingdom is that it seems as though it's actually exactly the same criteria that we think animal and human intelligence is satisfying, that will actually enable us to solve the next generation of problems in artificial intelligence as well. So if we think of the fact that it's going to enable complex behavior, the fact that it's generalizable to arbitrary sources of data, and also the fact that it's kind of largely unsupervised, all of these seem to be powerful ingredients for solving the next generation of AI problems, and these could be as diverse as scene understanding or robotic manipulation or visually grounded dialogue. And in addition to that, I find that these kind of three criteria for evaluating, in a sense, or sort of, assessing the progress that we've made in machine learning to be a sort of, very helpful lens, in a sense, for kind of categorizing the different types of progress that we've made. So we could look at, supervised learning, for example, which gave us some form of intelligent behavior by largely solving image classification, but it did so at a huge cost in manual annotation. And of course, this requirement actually on human labels very much limited its application to very specific settings. So we had ImageNet, and that allowed us to make extraordinary progress on image classification and maybe related tasks such as detection and segmentation. But this isn't going to allow us to solve robotic grasping, for example, or dialogue. So we're still kind of very much limited to the domain in which those labels were collected. So I would, of course, want to contrast this with self-supervised learning, which made very great progress in reducing this burden of manual annotation. And we've seen actually progress in self-supervised learning over actually like a pretty long period of time at this point. And I think it's kind of really interesting to see actually just how much progress was made with these kind of very sort of clever pretext tasks. So Robert Zhang, for example, came up with this kind of very clever image colorization algorithm, which to start out with was very compelling in terms of the kind of visual outputs that it was providing, but it was actually very surprising just how powerful the representations that this particular kind of learning procedure would yield. So something as simple as image colorization was actually sufficient to kind of learn fairly high-level image semantics. But however, so while this has reduced the burden of manual annotation, I think we're still in this kind of fairly limited regime in that it's unclear, for example, how we would apply image colorization to an entirely different modality. What does it mean to perform colorization on an audio signal or on text? So although these kind of pretext tasks make very good progress in limiting our reliance on human annotation, they still kind of did so at the cost of kind of generality, and they're still very much limited to these specific modalities in which they were developed. And I would argue that this actually changed fairly radically with the revival, actually, of contrastive learning. So kind of in contrast, no pun intended, to the kind of previous framework, this learning paradigm is actually extraordinarily simple and general. So in fact, it's so general that we, in fact, don't even need to show the kind of input modalities. So we just take a single input, generate two different views of that input, and that's oftentimes using some form of data augmentation, which exists in a variety of different modalities. And then we just take the representations of these two different views and maximize their similarity while minimizing the similarity with other data points. And so this framework was so simple and so general that it meant that it could really be seamlessly applied to arbitrary modalities and combinations of modalities, which really kind of seemingly paved the way for sort of generally applicable self-supervised learning. And indeed, and it's not, in fact, it's not just contrastive learning that has kind of really been powered by this simple paradigm of recognizing one view from from another view of the same image. But in fact, if we look at even more recent breakthroughs in self-supervised learning, so it started out with SimClear, but then we had Suave, for example, which further improved things, and then we got these new self-distillation approaches like BYOL and Dino, which kind of, in a sense, simplified things even further. But kind of fundamentally, all of these networks, or all of these kind of frameworks for learning networks, are relying on this kind of basic idea of basically predicting one view from another one, or maximizing the similarity of different views of the data. And so while it was kind of, I think, fairly amazing to see just how much progress could be made with such a simple paradigm, I think there was a sort of parallel line of work which has asked whether or not this particular learning recipe was in fact too simple. Because indeed, as we maximize the similarity of these data points across views, all of these methods are actually implicitly assuming that these different views contain the same underlying content. And this assumption might actually be fairly problematic, because we actually know that natural images contain multiple objects, which could have very different identities from one another. So I think a simple example of this is the image on the bottom left, where we have a piano on the one hand and an elephant on the other. and yet in maximizing the similarity of different views of this image, we're implicitly saying that actually pianos and elephants are the same thing, and we would like for our representations of these very different objects to be the same. So this is the case for natural images, but it's also going to be the case for natural speech, which contains multiple speakers. And maybe an extreme example of this is natural videos, which is not only going to have multiple objects per frame, but then different frames, of course, are going to depict different scenes with objects kind of coming in and out of the scene. So let's just maybe just kind of use a very concrete example. Let's go back to the original one, where let's imagine we're trying to learn representations of leopards and rabbits, and we're going to apply our favorite self-supervised learning paradigm to these images. And so we would construct these random crops, and it just so happens that these random crops are going to land on the one hand on the leopard and on the other hand on the rabbit. And so implicitly, we're going to be maximizing the similarity of our representations of rabbits and leopards, which then means that if we then go and go for a walk in the savannah, we won't actually be able to tell the difference between these two things. And we'll start petting leopards and try to run, or we'll be running away from rabbits. So it's there's clearly something fairly dysfunctional about an assumption that is at the heart of the current representation learning paradigm. So that's maybe slightly anecdotal evidence. Can we actually see kind of more empirical evidence of this mismatch between the assumptions that are baked into the learning paradigm and the statistics of real-world data? And so I think a very simple approach actually for kind of, in a sense, measuring this match or mismatch, or kind of measuring the relevance, I guess, of a learning algorithm with respect to the data that's being applied to, is transfer learning. So how does this work? Very briefly, we will use a learning algorithm to pre-train representations on some data set, and we tend to use ImageNet just because it's kind of very simple in general. And then we will take these representations and then transfer them to a downstream task, which measures various capabilities of the representation. And for this, we have like a sort of suite of scene understanding tasks, which we tend to use, which kind of go one step further than just simple classification, which to us seems a little bit too coarse. And so we'll go kind of one step below that to kind of object detection and semantic segmentation, which are not only going to test our ability to recognize different image classes, but also localize them in the scene. And we think that this is kind of particularly relevant because these are the kind of perceptual tests that need to be fulfilled if we then need to interact with the scene, which ultimately I think is what we're interested in. We want kind of behaviorally relevant perceptual representations. So let's kind of see this paradigm in action. So what I'm going to do here is just take a very simple self-supervised learning algorithm, which is SimClear, but also supervised learning, and I'll train them both on ImageNet for various pre-training budgets, and then take all of the resulting models. So I have one model per pre-training budget and per learning methodology. I'll take all of these models and then transfer them to object detection on the COCO dataset, and then I can simply kind of report their final accuracy after short amounts of fine-tuning on this detection dataset. And so, I guess maybe the first observation is that pre-training helps quite a bit. So if we compare the performance of pre-trained models, which are in red and orange, to an untrained model, which is just fine-tuned from scratch on COCO, then we actually see a big difference. So that's the bottom left corner against the other two colored curves. Then the other observation is that the pre-training methodology also matters quite a bit, and we're actually seeing that SimClear, although it eventually catches up with supervised pre-training, it actually takes quite a bit of computation to finally match that performance. In fact, we can quantify that a little bit and see that actually it takes SimClear 10 times more computation than supervised pre-training to get the same downstream accuracy as supervised pre-training. So this kind of computational inefficiency of SimClear we see as evidence that there's a sort of mismatch in a sense between the assumptions that are baked into the self-supervised objective and then the properties of the data that it is being applied to. So how do we fix this? How do we kind of, in a sense, relax the assumption that's baked into the heart of the self-supervised learning paradigm, and how do we kind of, in a sense, or adapt the learning paradigm to the complexity ultimately of real-world images? So our hypothesis is that ultimately the self-supervised learning paradigm should not really be performed or not be applied to whole images, because that's kind of disregarding the diversity that are contained in these images, but instead actually just be applied to the kind of atoms that consist that kind of make up these images. And these atoms should be sort of semantically consistent, such that if I take then random views of these atoms, then we would actually get sort of semantically related content. And so a really simple way of doing this would be to simply break up the image into its constituent objects, and then we would then apply our favorite learning algorithm to each object rather than each image. So this is kind of at a very high level what we're going to try to do in the kind of the sequence of works that I'll tell you about. But so maybe I think if there's just one thing that I'd like for you to take away from this talk, is that self-supervised learning should really be applied to individual objects, these sort of semantically consistent atoms, rather than whole images, which actually can contain many different objects within them. So for the rest of this talk, I'd like to take you through 3 different works, which are going to sort of illustrate this fruitful interplay between objects and representation learning. So in the first talk, I'll tell you about one work that shows that actually injecting this knowledge of objects into the self-supervised learning paradigm is not only going to accelerate learning, but also improve its performance. In the second work, we'll see that this knowledge of objects can in fact be extracted from the learned representations themselves. And this is going to be very helpful in that it's going to free us from these sort of domain-specific assumptions. And then finally, we'll look into extracting objects and representations of images from natural videos, which kind of contain a lot of rich information about object identity and object permanence and so on. So this brings me to the first work, which is contrastive detection, which was ultimately just a new objective that leverages the knowledge of objects to improve representation learning. So in order to tell you about contrastive detection, let me first give you a little bit of background on contrastive learning, although I'm sort of assuming that for this audience, you're pretty familiar with these sort of canonical learning methodologies, and so I'm assuming I can go pretty quickly over this. But if it's not the case, then please interrupt me. So right, in SimClear, we take each individual training example, we augment it twice, and then each view is encoded with a feature extractor, which is followed by global pooling. And the contrastive objective then takes these global representations of the image or of each view and then maximizes the similarity of these latents while minimizing the similarity across images. And you'll notice that in this formulation, each image actually only contributes one positive pair to the loss function shown in the numerator of the objective function. And since we're collecting negatives from other images, then that also means that each image is also only contributing a single negative sample for the other images. So we could say that this is maybe the first limitation of the formulation, and then the second one is something that I've alluded to previously, which is that these positive pairs can really suffer from the fact that they're actually covering very sort of distinct semantic content, and we're seeing an example of that in this particular image where these 2 different random crops have landed on an elephant and a piano respectively. So that was sort of vanilla contrastive learning. Let's now look into contrastive detection, which is the work that we proposed. So in this framework, we equip each training example with a set of masks, which approximately segments the image into different objects. And we'll look into how we get those masks in a second. But I'll just say that at this point, the segmentation algorithm that we're using to get these masks can be computed from the image itself. And so in that sense, even though we are using this additional information, that information comes from the image. And so therefore, the entire procedure is still entirely self-supervised. So as is usually the case in contrastive learning, we're going to construct 2 different augmentations of this image. But in this case, we're going to also carry through the masks that we've associated to the image through the augmentation pipeline, such that each view is also segmented, and it's segmented in a way that's consistent with the other view. So we will then pass these views through the same sort of convolutional network, and so this could be for example a ResNet or a vision transformer or what have you, just something that has an alignment between features and then parts of the image, and we'll then tag each feature according to the mask that it belongs to, and this is kind of useful because that way we can then pool features not globally, but instead pool features within each mask. And this gives us object level features, which we can then send into the contrastive objective. So you'll now notice that our objective is going to be applied to every one of these object level features rather than these kind of image level features that we had previously. And so this has a few nice properties. I mean, the first one is that each image now contributes as many kind of features into the contrastive loss as there are objects in the image. And so this also means that we have as many evaluations of loss as we have objects in the image rather than just a single one. And this actually comes with at no additional cost because we've done the same 2 forward passes and we just kind of pooled the features in a slightly different manner than previously. And then from that, we get multiple potentially independent learning signals because every one of these learning signals is coming from a different object. So we get more positive pairs per image. We also get more negative samples for the same reason. So now each image can contribute as many negative samples as it has objects in the scene. And this is going to, and we know that kind of more negative samples kind of give us a higher quality contrastive loss. And then finally, we also have the guarantee that these masks are spatially aligned. And so provided that the segmentation is good enough, provided that it's sort of coarsely separating the image into different objects, then we also have this guarantee that we're going to have sort of semantically related positive pairs rather than sort of random crops that could be covering very different content. So that's the sort of learning algorithm, and you'll have noticed that at this point, we actually haven't said anything about the actual configuration of the masks, and for good reason, because the objective itself is actually totally agnostic to the configuration of the masks. It can be used for any set of masks. And so here are some of the masks that we've considered. So the first one would just be a really simple spatial heuristic, which just divides the image up into a set of boxes of various sizes. We can also look at image computable masks that use kind of some type of heuristics for segmenting the image into different objects. And the Felsenswab algorithm is a very kind of simple and easy choice because it's just one call to scikit image, and then we get a segmentation of the image. And then, of course, we can use more sophisticated segmentation algorithms that have been proposed in the literature, but we just kind of use those for ablations. And in the rest of this talk, I'll just kind of focus on the main set of experiments, which use the Felsenswab algorithm, which is kind of like a very simple and easy choice, and does, you might say, like a reasonable job. It's far from perfect, but we're sort of curious to see how far we could get with a very simple segmentation algorithm. So with this, so now that we've kind of constructed our new learning algorithm, and so we wanted to now see whether or not it could address the kind of failure modes of kind of vanilla contrastive learning in this sort of transfer learning setup. So here and again, we'll pre-train a ResNet 50 on ImageNet using either supervised learning or one of 2 self-supervised objectives. It could be SimClear or the proposed DECCON objective. And in order to evaluate the quality of these representations, we just transfer them to COCO detection and segmentation using, again, a mask RCNN. And as a quick reminder, supervised pre-training quickly leads to good transfer performance, whereas SimClear catches up rather slowly. So I guess, so now we've run our proposed contrastive detection objective on the same ImageNet pre-training, and we find that in contrast to SimClear, it actually quickly surpasses supervised pre-training, and in fact leads to better representations than SimClear, using quite a bit less computation. So we're surpassing a fully trained SimClear with a model that's been trained for 5 times fewer iterations. So at this point, we were also curious to see, how specific these results were to object detection. And so, I guess we had sort of, tentatively called the algorithm contrastive detection. So maybe we were sort of, curious to see maybe it only helps for detection tasks. But instead, we actually found that it also helps for instance segmentation on COCO, but also semantic segmentation on Pascal and cityscapes, and depth estimation on the NYU dataset. So across the board, we're getting sort of gains in efficiency from this kind of very simple modification to the contrastive objective that are on the order of a factor of like 2 all the way up to 10, depending on the transfer learning task that we are considering. And you might see that, like, in fact, it's the more sort of localization sensitive the task is, actually the larger the gains in efficiency are. So thus far, we found that kind of, in a sense, modifying the SimClear objective into this kind of more kind of object-centric contrastive detection objective led to fairly large gains in computational efficiency. But we were also curious in kind of seeing how general this framework was. And for that, we asked whether these gains that would be afforded by DECCON would also hold up if they were applied to other frameworks, such as BYOL. And so we can think of BYOL in a sense as like an augmentation of SimClear, in that it has better prediction heads. It has these additional target networks, has better augmentations. It uses exponential moving averages in the target networks. And so we essentially just applied these exactly the same modifications to DETCON, which gave us a new variant of DETCON, which we call DETCON-B. And what we found is that if we then transfer these models to COCO detection, we find that DETCON-B, when only trained for 300 epochs, surpasses BYOL when trained for 1,000 epochs, which indicates, again, a sort of gain in computational efficiency of around a factor of 3. And this was also the case when transferring to a variety of other tasks, where we found pretty systematic gains in pre-training efficiency from maybe factors of 3 to 10 across the kind of evaluation suite that we considered. And maybe just also for good measure, we compared these fully trained models to the previous state-of-the-art and found that they fairly comfortably could surpass all prior work on transfer learning, whether it's supervised or self-supervised. So finally, this was all done in the context of the single architecture, which was ResNet 50, but we also wanted to know whether or not these gains would hold up when we transfer to larger models. So for that reason, we also trained deeper ResNets again on ImageNet. So these could be ResNet 101, 150, or 200, and find that kind of fairly systematically, these models, when pre-trained with contrastive detection, would continue to outperform SimClear, BYOL, but also supervised pre-training. All of this when transferring to COCO. And so around the time that we were running these experiments, actually our colleagues at FAIR came out with a very impressive self-supervised model called SEER, which strongly surpassed their supervised baseline by training a very large model at the time, almost 700 million parameters on a truly gigantic data set, which was 1 billion Instagram images. And so this really motivated us to try to kind of scale up our model, to sort of what we thought would be, like much larger than what we had considered previously. So for this reason, we also took a ResNet 200, but then doubled the width, making it like a 250 million parameter model. But again, just training it on ImageNet. And what we find is that fairly surprisingly, this model, although it's quite a bit smaller than the SEER model and trained on 1,000 times less data, matches its performance across these sort of detection and segmentation tasks. So of course, the comparison isn't perfect because these large-scale data sets are necessarily noisier. So it's hard to say that 1,000 times more data is 1,000 times better, say. But I think this does really highlight the potential for just improvements from the learning objective all by itself, kind of independently from any kind of scaling. I think it really shows that there's quite a bit of headroom for just pure algorithmic improvements. So, okay, so thus far we found that sort of injecting this knowledge of objects into the self-supervised paradigm accelerated its convergence and improved the quality of its representations. And we kind of baked in this knowledge of objects into with this contrastive detection algorithm. And we, in a sense, we did so by drawing on this unsupervised segmentation algorithm, which has a fair amount of prior knowledge associated to it. So I'm just showing you like a quick snapshot of the Felsenswab algorithm that we used for all the results that I showed to you previously. And you can see that there's a fair amount of details, like it's going to compute minimum spanning trees on this kind of graph that it's constructed on pixel-based similarity, and it's going to do some graph cuts and things like that. So there's actually a fair amount of prior knowledge baked into it. And this was just fine for running on natural images, which the Felsenswab algorithm was optimized for. But it's sort of unclear, to what extent this algorithm would then generalize to other domains like satellite imagery or medical data, in where the objects of these images actually have very different scales and statistics. And so I think the last thing that we want to do is kind of have to retune our supposedly self-supervised objective on every new source of data that we have. Ideally, we would just kind of seamlessly apply it to these different sources of data. And of course, ideally, we would go even further than just images. We'd also like to be able to learn strong semantic representations of audio, video, and text. And so for this reason, we really asked ourselves whether we could, in a sense, free ourselves from the kind of handcrafted segmentation algorithm that contrastive detection was relying on, and instead extract the knowledge of objects from the learned representations themselves. So this brings me to our second work, Object Discovery and Representation Networks, or ODIN for short. And maybe I'll just pause for a second to see if you have any questions on the first part. Otherwise, I'll just carry on.
Maybe I have just a quick one. Did you also evaluate the image level quality of networks trained with DETCON?
Yeah, so with a simple classification task, for example.
For example, yeah.
Yeah. So we also looked at transfer. So that it came out, I think, during the reviews of the paper, and so we ran those experiments, but I think we forgot to kind of add them in the final version. They actually come out very similarly to the baseline. So and then I think that's sort of consistent with the other evaluations. We are sort of seeing a gradient, I guess, in the efficiency gains. So for transfer learning tasks that were, for example, very sort of classification-like, maybe with the efficiency gains were kind of small-ish, like maybe just a factor of 2, for example. But whereas when we get into kind of these kind of more like localization-heavy tasks, like depth estimation, we had this factor of 10 improvement, and detection and segmentation are, in a sense, somewhere in between the two. And so for I think classification, I think came out basically kind of maybe marginally better than this kind of SimClear baseline, but fairly similar. So I think it kind of tells us that there's in a sense, maybe just simple classification tasks don't really actually measure your ability to kind of tell apart these different objects, for example.
Cool. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so let's dive into these object discovery and representation networks, which are now going to try to kind of free ourselves from the kind of domain-specific assumptions that the previous work, contrastive detection, had. So let me just dive into the algorithm directly. So the first two components of Odin are what we call object representation networks, and they're in fact identical to the contrastive detection setup. So here and again, we're going to augment the image twice, and then compute features for each of these views. And then we're going to assume that we have a set of masks that parse this image into objects, and then use these masks to pool features within each mask. And then it's these object level features that are going to be sent into the contrastive objective exactly in the same way as before. So now the question, of course, is, we've removed this handcrafted segmentation algorithm. So where are these segmentations coming from in that case? So in order to get them, we're going to introduce a third view, which this time is not augmented, and is going to span the spatial extent of the other two views. We then encode this image with a third network, which we call an object discovery network, which can be just a simple exponential moving average of one of the object representation networks. And then we perform a very simple just k-means clustering on top of its features, and this is going to give us a set of segmentation masks. And now, because this third view spans the spatial extent of the first two views, we can simply crop and resize these segmentation masks to align them with the other two views. And the intuition behind our method is in fact very simple. We have a very powerful representation learning objective, which, even though it's kind of using at the beginning of training fairly approximate masks, it's still going to give us fairly powerful object level features. And these object level features are then going to allow a sort of approximate parsing of this image into objects. And in turn, we can then use this kind of higher quality segmentation of the image to then kind of feed it back into the learning objective, which is going to kind of better guide the learning process and is going to give us better features still. And from there, we can sort of engage in this virtuous cycle of representation and segmentation quality. So again, we're going to test our method using a very similar transfer learning setup. So we'll pre-train the network on ImageNet and then fine-tune it on a variety of downstream tasks. And here I'm showing you the previous state of the art on transfer learning on object detection on Coco. And I'm just going to highlight the second column of the table, which indicates whether they use some prior knowledge of scene structure or objects as part of the learning algorithm. So you'll notice, DETCON appears as using this prior knowledge because it has this segmentation algorithm that's baked into its objective. But similarly, Relic v2 also uses unsupervised segmentations as part of its augmentation process. And you'll notice, maybe unsurprisingly, that these two methods happen to kind of top the charts when it comes to transfer learning to these object level tasks. So I think what we were kind of pleasantly kind of surprised by, or what we found it to be encouraging, is that Odin has no access to this prior knowledge, and yet when transferred to these object understanding tasks, it performs as well or better than methods that do rely on this kind of knowledge of objects. And so we sort of interpret this as that the fact that Odin actually might be extracting this knowledge of objects and the structure of scenes actually just by itself. Like knowledge of objects might be this sort of emergent property of the learning paradigm, such that we actually don't need to kind of specify these objects ahead of time and by hand. So that was object detection. We also looked at semantic segmentation on both Pascal and cityscapes, and we found very similar picture. So here and again, the top-ranking methods are all using some kind of prior knowledge of objects and scene structure, and here and again, Odin is able to surpass these methods by just extracting this knowledge by itself, whilst being a method that's completely agnostic to any notion of objects. And finally, we were also curious to kind of scale up these methods. And so for that reason, we looked at these more recent Swin transformers. So I think the first observation there is that self-supervised learning interacts very well with these higher capacity models. So for example, we just reran contrastive detection now with Swin transformers, and we actually kind of get really nice scaling behavior, kind of a pretty healthy improvement over supervised pre-training, for example. And then in this setting also, we find that Odin is able to kind of match the performance of contrastive detection, for example, while still kind of freeing ourselves from the kind of prior knowledge that DETCON benefits from. So these transfer learning results were really just a suggestion, I think, that that Odin is actually implicitly learning to segment images into objects as part of its learning process. So at this point, we really kind of wanted to kind of go in a little bit more precisely and actually test this idea more explicitly by actually examining the unsupervised segmentations that are obtained as part of the kind of object discovery process that we have this object discovery network for. So in order to get at this question, we applied the object discovery network on Coco, which comes equipped with human annotated masks. And we are simply going to look at the k-means segmentations that the object discovery network uses as part of the learning. And we can compare these unsupervised segments to the human annotated ones. And so what you can see is that, of course, these unsupervised segmentations are highly imperfect. Sometimes they'll miss the object boundaries. They can kind of merge different elements together, like the person's legs, for example, are confounded with the motorcycle that he's sitting on. But they're kind of doing maybe a fairly reasonable job of kind of roughly parsing the image into different objects. So it's able to separate the person from the motorcycle and the top image, but also the knife and from the table and person on the bottom image. And so maybe what's even more revealing in a sense is is if we apply actually the same evaluation protocol, this time to a different set of representations. For example, like a supervised network that's been trained on ImageNet, or just a randomly initialized one. And there we find some pretty dramatic failures of object discovery, where for example very completely different objects are being merged together, or sometimes these masks can be completely delocalized in the case of the random network. So this tells us, I think especially the relative comparison kind of tells us that Odin seems to actually have done a reasonable job of kind of uncovering the structure of objects in these real world scenes. These are just a new set of examples where here and again we find that Odin to perform I'd say quite a bit better than alternative representations. Even though we can also see some failure modes with Odin, for example, like merging two kids together. So it's not really able to differentiate one child from another, but instead it's kind of partitions them in terms of top and bottom halves, for example, which you might say is kind of, if you only had access to image level statistics, then maybe it's sort of a reasonable partition, and kind of suggests that the sort of unsupervised object discovery is maybe a little bit poorly specified, but it's so it's doing something maybe reasonable, but of course very imperfect. So we can then actually measure this, or I guess quantify this evaluation by measuring the overlap between these unsupervised segmentations and then the human annotated ones, and then essentially kind of compare these different representations like we were doing qualitatively. And here we find Odin to perform quite a bit better than any other pre-trained representation that we looked at, including the recently proposed Dino network, which was doing a very nice job of separating in a sense, like the figure from the ground, or kind of foreground separation. So this was all for ResNets. We also ran this object discovery analysis on vision transformers, which we pre-trained in the same way. And here and again, we find that Odin to perform quite a bit better than, for example, Dino pre-trained vision transformers. And since we're talking about the difference between Odin and Dino, we thought that we would just kind of look at a few example images also. And we found that interestingly, Dino seems to be doing a good job of maybe separating different object classes from one another, but is sort of merging maybe different instances of cars together, whereas Odin might be doing a slightly better job at kind of separating those different car instances from one another. Although of course these results are far from perfect. So to conclude this section, we've proposed a new method, which we call Odin, which extracts the knowledge of objects from its own representations and feeds them back into its learning objective. And this gives us two things. On the one hand, we have, again, state-of-the-art transfer learning performance, while kind of freeing ourselves from the assumptions that prior work had. And we in our opinion, kind of much richer transformations than still images. And they also have these motion cues, which we think should be essential actually for learning about objects. So what we found interesting when we were starting this project is that it seems as though videos are this sort of goldmine of information for learning visual representations. Surely if you look at those videos on the bottom here, they just have so much more information about the properties of the world than the kind of still images on the top. And yet, when you look at the kind of the literature on video representation learning, you find all sorts of examples, in fact, very compelling examples of video pre-training being useful for learning video representations, but actually very few examples of videos being helpful for learning image representations. And yet, it didn't really wasn't really apparent to us why this would be the case. It seems as though the kind of richness of videos should also allow us to learn very powerful image representations. So in the last part of this talk, I'd like to just dive in a little bit more into this kind of less explored realm of learning image representations from video. And in a sense, maybe the title is going to spoil the end, but we'll see a little bit how we got there. So in order to get at video representation learning, we actually simplified the self-supervised paradigm that we're going to look into by starting out with a very simple contrastive baseline, which we call MoClear. In fact, we haven't proposed MoClear. It had been developed by Young Long Chan actually when he was interning here at DeepMind, which is a very simple combination actually of SimClear, BYOL, and MoCo, and it just sort of takes, in a sense, sort of the best of all of the three frameworks. So it has a lot of the architectural elements of BYOL, like it's going to use an exponential moving average target network, but it's also going to use the contrastive objective from SimClear, but also the augmentations of BYOL. So it's this kind of sort of a mix of many different frameworks, but as a result, which performs very strongly on a variety of different tasks, while still being extraordinarily simple. I mean, at its heart, it's really just maximizing the similarity of two different views of the data, and yet it has like all of the sort of implementation details that make it work very well. And so, as usual, you might have gotten used to this by now. We'll evaluate our representations by fine-tuning them on the kind of scene understanding suite that we know and love, and this is going to include semantic segmentation and object detection baselines. So I guess our first question was really just to what extent does the distribution of image content affect the representation quality when we just apply the same learning algorithm to a variety of different data sets? So to start out with, we'll just treat videos as a collection of image frames. And at that point, you can just apply your favorite learning algorithm directly to those video frames. So we did so on Kinetics and YouTube, How to 100 Million, an audio set, and then of course ImageNet. And what we find is a pretty striking drop in performance, even though the model, the learning paradigm, everything is strictly identical across all these experiments, and it's just the distribution of the data that has changed. And it turns out that this actually leads to a serious deterioration in representation quality as measured by transfer learning performance on Pascal semantic segmentation. And in a sense, when you actually look at some of the frames from these video data sets, maybe not that surprising. Why? Because some of these frames, I'm looking at the kinetic ones, for example, are extraordinarily noisy. You have like very blurry frames. The bottom one, it's almost entirely blank, just because it's so zoomed in on some wave or something like that. Audio set has unnatural videos in it. This anime character in the middle there, and so it sort of makes sense. Especially when you compare that to these sort of iconic images of dogs and cats and strawberries and so on. You have an ImageNet that the representations that you would learn from this kind of very noisy data wouldn't be as performant. So that brought us actually to develop a very simple video curation pipeline, which we call VideoNet, which very roughly aligns the distribution of video content to that of ImageNet. And you can see just a kind of simple example frames from VideoNet, and sure enough, we find that we have these kind of more sort of ImageNet-like scenes, in that it's maybe going to be a simple single object, sort of centered, and maybe the kind of image content is also going to be slightly more natural, or like ImageNet-like. So roughly, let's see, right. So roughly, how does VideoNet curation work? Well, so we take just random videos sampled from the internet, and then we'll query those videos with using the 1,000 ImageNet classes, and then we'll simply verify that the video actually contains that particular class by running an ImageNet classifier on every one of those frames. And then if the classifier doesn't recognize that video as actually being that class that we queried it for, then we simply discard it. So we basically have like a simple way of getting videos from the internet that kind of roughly correspond to the 1,000 classes in ImageNet. Although if you actually look at the distribution of classes that we're able to get from this procedure, it's not at all as kind of balanced as ImageNet. It's actually kind of fairly skewed. That's probably would be a really simple way of improving this method. Regardless, if we now look at the kind of transfer performance of representations that have been trained on VideoNet, we find that they at the very least kind of go in the right direction. So it does seem as though kind of just a very simple alignment of the data distribution of these videos to the ones that we'll encounter in the real world is going to kind of go some way in kind of improving the representation quality. So that was a kind of a pure sort of change to the data, but we also wanted to maybe kind of see whether or not the kind of learning methodology could actually sort of be improved to better handle the kind of complex transformations that we have in natural videos. So to start out with, we're actually going to treat videos as videos, not just still frames. So this was the simplest change. Rather than just taking two augmentations of the same image, we would simply take two different frames from the video and use each one of those frames as its own augmentation, and then continue to augment them as we were previously. But now we have the combination of both synthetic augmentations and the natural transformations that are present in natural videos. So now, similarly to before, we can process each of these views with some sort of convolutional feature extractor, like a ResNet, for example. But now, contrarily to before, we will no longer have ground truth correspondences between these two different frames, because actually the content could have moved. So previously, when we were augmenting the same image twice, we actually had the possibility of establishing ground truth correspondences. That's no longer the case. And so for that reason, we introduced a really simple attentional network. It's just a 2-layer NLP, which takes as input the features at every location, and then outputs a scalar attention mask, which we're going to use to then pool those features and then give us a single, in a sense, object level feature, which will then kind of send into the contrastive loss as before. And so this attention mask is actually going to allow us to perform that alignment between these two different views. But crucially, we're going to train the entire network, including the attentional module, in an end-to-end manner. And so that we were kind of pretty happy with this, because it sort of simplifies the procedure quite a bit, and that that now the whole thing is learned. So maybe just quickly seeing to what extent these different modifications help. So the first I guess the first improvement was having to do with this attentional pooling, and we also have a sort of multi-scale version of it, which is a simple modification to that, and that turned out to improve performance quite a bit. We also find that kind of going from these purely synthetic augmentations to also including the natural augmentations by including two different video frames rather than just a single frame at a time to help performance. And then finally, we found that we actually had to modify the synthetic augmentations a little bit by kind of having slightly less aggressive random resize co-ops. And so together, it actually turns out that these changes are sufficient to close the gap with ImageNet pre-training. So I think what's kind of interesting actually is to kind of look at these sort of attentional maps that the network learns as just purely in satisfying the contrastive objective. And we actually find that they seem to behave in a very interpretable manner. So it seems to kind of really be zeroing in on the kind of most distinctive content in the scene. So we see that in the right pair of frames where the attentional module is actually disregarding the background and just focusing in on the foreground objects, which is also going to be sort of most discriminable if we then contrast that to negative samples from the data set. And then what I found really interesting is also the pair of images on the left, where this time there are, let's say, two different images or two objects in the image. And so in a sense, the attentional module could have attended to either of them, and yet it's actually attended to the left one because that one happens to be more stable. So you can see that the one on the right actually has changed quite a bit from one frame to the next. And so the attentional module has actually learned to disregard this object that is changing too abruptly and just focusing on the stable content. Potentially even more interesting, I find, is that this sort of attentional module is actually learning, in a sense, to associate different elements of content, but that are still predictive of one another. So you can see, on the kind of rightmost pair, top frame, the attention is focusing on the arm. On the bottom one, it's actually focusing on the dumbbell. So kind of different types of content, and yet that are kind of very semantically related. And so we think that this actually could be kind of sort of driving the underlying performance for kind of semantic segmentation and object detection capabilities. We can also look at these attentional maps over time. We actually find them to, sometimes have these slight little flickers. It might be a little bit noisy at times, but it's still actually doing a pretty good job of, let's say, tracking the same object over time. And I find that it's able to do that actually even despite pretty extreme transformations. So if you look at second column top row, you find this snowplow that's actually being shown in very different from very different angles. We see it from the side and then from the back, and yet the attentional module is actually able to kind of associate these very different views. So we think that this is really evidence for just kind of the richness of videos as a pre-training data. So finally, let's kind of get at the kind of initial question, which was whether or not this kind of video pre-training is sufficient actually to kind of close the gap with image pre-training. So the first thing was to maybe just look at our kind of proposed video pre-training method in relation to previous methods, which also looked at pre-training from videos. And there we see a pretty sizable gap actually. So although these other methods had actually kind of gained pretty interesting capabilities in video understanding, we find that they lag pretty seriously behind in terms of image understanding, and Veto is actually doing quite a bit better on them. So it's, the gaps are on the order of like 5% or more on a wide range of data sets. And this is even compared to some kind of very recent and very powerful like multimodal methods, which are kind of learning in a sort of not purely self-supervised anymore. They're kind of learning from this kind of large-scale text supervision, and yet Veto is comfortably outperforming them. So the last kind of question was maybe just a sort of sanity check to see whether or not, given the sort of fully developed Veto method, do we still benefit from data curation? And it turns out that is the case. So VideoNet pre-training actually helps quite a bit over audio set pre-training, although you'll still notice that even training Veto on audio set is still sufficient to surpass these other methods. And then of course, the last question was, have we closed the gap between video pre-training and ImageNet pre-training on the kind of whole suite of scene understanding tasks that we've considered, and indeed that turns out to be the case. So if we look at this wide variety of image pre-training tasks, we find that Veto is kind of very competitive with all of them. So it's slightly better than them on some of the tasks, slightly worse on the other ones, but we think that this is basically within the error bars. And so this is, to the best of our knowledge, actually the first example of video pre-training being competitive with ImageNet pre-training on these sort of canonical image understanding tasks. So to conclude, what we've seen in throughout this talk is really what I think of as a sort of virtuous cycle actually between the kind of knowledge of objects in the real world and learning representations that solve real-world tasks. So, in the first part, we found that injecting knowledge of objects into the learning algorithm greatly improved the resulting representations, and that was the contrastive detection algorithm. In the second part, we found that we could actually free ourselves from the sort of domain-specific assumptions in the previous algorithm in contrastive detection by instead learning about objects and sort of extracting this knowledge of objects from the learned representations themselves, giving us a sort of modality agnostic learning methodology. And then finally, we found that while learning from videos has typically lagged behind image pre-training when it comes to learning image representations, we found that a very small number of simple tricks were sufficient to close this gap. And so looking forward, I think that there'll be a very fruitful interaction between extracting object knowledge from videos, where motion cues greatly simplify the problem, and learning representations that can guide intelligent behavior. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
Clap, clap. Great, thanks. Thanks, Olivier. All right, I'll invite everyone to think of questions. All right, there's a question already, Artem.
Hello, thanks for a very nice presentation. I have a question regarding Odin. So in contrast to DETCONF, like the DETCONF, you rely on specific modality because you use this segmentation algorithms to obtain masks. But in Odin, it's kind of fully end-to-end, and it learns these algorithms inside. So in that sense, my question is, do you think it can be applied to other modalities as it is, or it would require some additional adaptation, like to audio, for example, or time series?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess so. Maybe to start out with, I guess what are the remaining domain-specific assumptions that we have? And I think it's just the augmentations at this point. So I guess when we have the representation learning network, we're using these kind of pairs of augmentations in order to kind of learn those representations, and then from those we get segmentations and so on. So, but I think audio is very much falls in that category because we have standard set of augmentations that people have used for representation learning, and at that point, now your object discovery is, I guess, going to be segmenting the audio stream into maybe different phonemes, for example, and you could actually evaluate the quality of those segmentations in that respect, and then kind of use those segmentations to then kind of pipe them back into the learning framework. And it seems like it should also help for exactly the same reason, because maybe you have different speakers, for example, in the kind of audio stream. Now, I think what's potentially interesting is that you could also imagine segmenting it not just in time, but also, for example, in terms of the spectrum. And so now you're sort of doing this like unsupervised demixing simultaneously with the sort of temporal segmentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. I think the next question was from Cindy.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the really nice talk. I also have a question about Odin, actually. You were describing that you were using k-means for the object discovery module. And from the images, it looked like you chose k to match the number of objects that are in the image. Is that right?
Right. So yeah, so I guess I should clarify, there's actually sort of two different regimes in which we perform the segmentation. So the first regime is just during learning, in which case we just hard code k to be a kind of fixed number, which I think that's maybe what I like the least actually about the algorithm, is that we have this assumption which is clearly incorrect, right? So we choose 16 objects per image, which is not at all adaptive. And I think the one sort of saving grace is that it could be that we can actually get away with an over segmentation actually of images, and that's actually sufficient to learn good quality representations of them. But then still there's a sort of second step, which is doing evaluation, when we kind of want to look at the sort of object discovery capabilities of the representation. And there the protocol is, since we don't know the number of objects ahead of time, we actually sweep the number that k, I think from 1 all the way up to I think 128. So that gives us a set of objects as a number of segmentations per k. So I think it's maybe like 250 proposals in total. And then ultimately we're just looking at the overlap between the best proposal and the ground truth. And so I guess you might say like, well, that kind of sounds, kind of sounds like cheating. It's not purely unsupervised before, or anymore. But I think what's interesting is that despite choosing the best segmentation, some representations are still going to fail this test. So you look at the supervised representation or the random one, and even their best proposal is terrible. So it seems as though, although it's imperfect, and obviously you don't want for that number of proposals to get too large, it's still kind of a discriminative test, I guess, of the quality of those representations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I think the next one was from Mohammed Reza.
Hey, thank you for your talk. And regarding to the numbers reported for transfer learning on Pascal, are they full fine-tuning numbers or just linear classification numbers?
Yeah, we do full fine-tuning all the time.
Yeah, but I think, have you ever tried linear classification on the final features? Because I think in that way, you are only using the final features and with one linear layer, and this better shows the quality of the features for the transfer learning task.
Yeah, so I'm totally with you. I think generally we need more tools like that, actually, which kind of that satisfy two properties. Like, first off, that are absolute assessments of the representation compared to the representation after fine-tuning, which could be just about anything. I mean, I think what's kind of amazing is that fine-tuning is still sufficient to uncover the differences in representations, but it's noisy. It requires a lot of computation. You do a whole bunch of repeats and then average across repeats to get kind of high quality numbers. And so that kind of slows down the iteration cycle. And then also, yeah, I guess you have now this sort of mismatch, I guess, between the number and then what the representation was originally. So yeah, I'm with you that I think linear classification is a much nicer protocol in that respect. I think I guess the one reason why we use fine-tuning is that that's ultimately what people are going to be using this for. So it's sort of a tension, I guess, between the sort of the sort of research, the precision in terms of the research statement, the scientific statement, and then its kind of practical relevance. And so what we tend to do is we'll actually use linear classification for model development, but then we'll in the final paper, for example, we'll just do fine-tuning, because otherwise it's just have too many metrics.
Thank you. And also I have another question about the Odin paper. Do you apply k-means in the beginning of the training process when the networks are randomly initialized, or?
Yeah. So it's the same learning algorithm throughout.
So I think have you done ablation studies on changing different hyperparameters and this kinds of things? Because I think if in this way it would be a little bit hyperparameter sensitive.
Yeah. So I think what kind of saves us here is the fact that we still have one inductive bias, which is kind of carrying the whole thing forward. Even if you have noisy masks, you have these augmentations, I guess, and you're maximizing the similarity of those augmentations, and you're also minimizing the similarity with other images. And so that, in a sense, is some source of ground truth. Even if the partition of the image is noisy, we're still going to be learning like decent enough representations with those inductive biases. And that's going to be sufficient to give us reasonable segmentations. And then when those come online, it's just going to improve things further. But it's not as if we can kind of get stuck in this local minimum because we're only learning from those segmentations.
So you mean even random network can provide good segmentation maps with k-means?
I'd say it's actually, even if this, so yes, I think that is the case actually. That's because you actually saw there was an example from those random networks. And of course, so they're much worse, but they're not terrible. Like, for example, a random network will not give you random segmentations because you have, all the inductive biases of convolutions and hierarchy and stuff like that. They're going to give you non-trivial segmentations. But then I think on top of that, even given poor quality segmentations, the learning algorithm is robust enough that it's still going to learn, let's say decent representations, and then you kind of improve from there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Next was Anderson.
Hey, Olivier, thanks for the great talk. I think that the veto model is really exciting and a step in the right direction, and specifically like the augmentations in some sense coming from the video is really cool. I guess I was a little bit surprised, but maybe shouldn't have been, that also you needed kind of actual input augmentations. So I guess the main question is, if you go back to the biological motivation, do you think there is a biological equivalent to augmentation, either explicitly or implicitly?
Yeah.
I think all of the augmentations come from time.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. Thanks for that question. So yeah, I guess first off, we were totally with you that we were hoping to kind of remove those augmentations because of the natural ones, because we feel like, okay, that's yet more domain-specific knowledge that we want to kind of free ourselves from. We really want for this to be as data-driven as possible. And we actually found, we don't show it in the paper, unfortunately, but we actually found that it was more robust to removing those augmentations, for a reason that you would, I mean, it's kind of pretty clear why that'd be the case. So I think it's going in the right direction, but still, in order to get kind of competitive numbers, you still need basically all of the kind of prior knowledge that's captured by those augmentations. So we still depend on that. So yeah, is there any justification from the biological perspective of using these synthetic augmentations? And I'd say surprisingly yes. So first off, we don't have a fixed view on the scene, and we're just kind of watching the world go by. We're actually saccading. In fact, very, very often it's like you have like 3 saccades per second where you'll like move your eyes around, and those can be pretty abrupt. Like it's a sort of ballistic eye movement actually that's kind of going and sampling potentially very different parts of the scenes. That sounds a lot like random cropping to me. So I think to start out with, maybe random crops are reasonable, and then on top of that, there's a lot of noise actually in our photoreceptors. So so now, to be clear, that noise is probably going to be independent across photoreceptors. So, would you get a sort of coherence, color shifts as you get currently? It would probably be more like sort of salt and peppery noise. Now, I think what's potentially even more interesting is that it's not just noise in the photoreceptors. You actually have noise like at every stage of the visual hierarchy. And so sort of noise at like intermediate feature layers would actually translate into potentially much kind of larger deformations in image space. So, noise, for example, after, let's say, a set of like oriented filters, for example, would actually start looking like, slight, rotations, for example, or kind of smooth deformations of the space. So yeah, and yet, so I guess 2 things. First off, it's amazing that our, perceptual experience is not hallucinatory in that way. Like we're not, seeing things kind of like, shift around like that. So that's, I think that speaks to the, the strength of the priors that we're applying to this sort of sensory information that's coming at us. But then I think it also tells you that, well, I mean, maybe we can also use that as a learning signal.
Okay, yeah, that's very cool. Thanks, that makes a lot of sense.
Thanks.
All right. If you have time for 2 more questions, perhaps.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Then I think it was Xiaoyan, and after that, Melika.
Oh, okay. Hi, Olive. Very nice talk. So my question is also follows like Artem and this is about the augmentation. So I was wondering, did you like evaluate the performance of the method regarding on different augmentation methods? So for example, like if you do the most like the structure level augmentation, like you change the shape of object or you like rotate the object, will this help the network better? Or you do some intrinsic level augmentation, like you change the color, you add more like different illumination on it? Would that help this performance about the method? Thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, that's really cool. So right, you could imagine that because in a sense, I guess we do this really just kind of for ease of comparison with previous works, but usually what we do is we just kind of take the standard augmentation pipeline and then stack our new idea on top of that, so that we don't need to ablate that further. But I think you're totally right that you could do something a lot more clever than that, which would be to say you apply the object discovery network to the unaugmented image. So that's similar to what we've done. That gives us some notion of where the objects are in the scene. And at that point, you could actually start augmenting every one of those objects independently from one another. And now you actually have like a much richer learning signal, because you again have these independent kind of like loss evaluations for every object in the scene. So that strikes me as like a kind of much more sort of powerful paradigm. And I think we have some evidence of that working already in this Relic V2 paper. So I was saying that they also use this unsupervised segmentation, but they bake it into their augmentation pipeline, and they find that helps them quite a bit. So it's still just isolating a single object at a time, but I think you could easily extend it in the way that you're mentioning. I think that'd be really cool.
All right, cool. Thanks.
Yeah,
Monica.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I had a question also about the last about veto framework. And I was wondering, because if you look at a video, if you look into closer frames, then you basically have almost the same frame. And if you look at a bit further frames, then the changes are more substantial. And you mentioned also that because you didn't have the spanning view to use the k-means and then change that for each augmentation. I was just thinking, if you pick two close frames, then the k-means would kind of be similar for both of them. And because also this k-means is not super detailed and super great, then maybe it could work out. Did you try to do this also for your did you try it in your approach before trying the linear layer?
Right. I think it's a really good point. You could imagine it's actually like I think what you're describing is a more sort of Odin-like approach to learning from videos, where you would actually apply the object discovery network now to like the pairs of frames. You would co-segment them, and then you would send those into the object discovery networks. I think that'd be a really cool thing to try. I think it makes a lot of sense for sure.
And the frames that you tried as augmentations, how far away were they from each other?
Yeah, it's just 2 seconds. So we take an interval that's 2 seconds long, and then we sample pairs of frames from that.
So that's not a super easy, but not also that hard.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And so we tune that, and we find that there's like a sweet spot there.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, then maybe I'll just ask one last big question. So, Olivier, what do you think is going to be the next big thing?
So actually, I mean, I think kind of very similar to what Malika was mentioning. I think we're really interested in now combining these things. So we think that we actually want kind of like a full like object level understanding of real world videos, where we can not only discover these objects, but also kind of understand their dynamics over time. I think that would be like a sort of compelling demonstration of these sort of perceptual capabilities, but it also seems like a very powerful learning signal.
Cool. Yeah. Yep. I would agree.
Awesome.
Cool stuff.
Yeah. Looking forward to chatting about that later, hopefully.
Yep. We should indeed. All right. Cool. Then I think I speak for everyone that we are very thankful for having you been here virtually. Great talk, really cool research, and yeah, we hope to see you live at some point in the near future.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And yeah, thanks again for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right, cool. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Take it easy. Bye-bye.